Over to state politics now, and on the line is Darren Cheeseman, the state MP for South Barwon. Darren, good morning.
Good morning to you, Mitchell.
So first of all, a COVID update. It seems like we're on the right track. The numbers are slightly up today compared to yesterday, but I think the main thing is we're in the 100s, and when you look at that 5-day average, it shows that things are moving downwards.
Well, that's right, Mitchell. Obviously, Victorians have made a significant sacrifice really over the last 3 or 4 weeks to really drive these numbers down. We're not out of the woods yet, but certainly if you listen carefully to what the Chief Health Officer has to say, he's very pleased with the direction that the numbers are going. We've still got just a bit over 2.5 weeks to go before this current phase of the pandemic is responded to, and I'm looking forward to those numbers being further driven down to keep us all safe, to make sure our health and hospital system doesn't get overwhelmed.
Is there a case for saying that maybe regional Victoria can come out of restrictions before metropolitan Melbourne if our numbers are doing well, which it seems like in the city of Greater Geelong and Surf Coast they're heading in the right direction, and the Premier even said he was quite pleased with how regional Victoria was going in his media conference on the weekend?
Well, look, absolutely. Right from the word go, we have had the Chief Health Officer recognise that regional Victoria, the risk of the spread of the virus is different to that of metropolitan Melbourne. It's the reason why he's recommended, with the current phase of the lockdowns, for regional Victoria to be considered differently. Victoria, of course, right across the board, Victorians have broadly been doing the right thing, and that's why we've been able to drive these numbers back down. Of course, we know through watching what's been happening here in Victoria, in other states, and indeed across the globe, that there are certain vulnerable settings where once the virus gets in, it's very hard to get rid of it. Nursing homes, abattoirs, those kind of locations. We've got to work very, very hard to make sure that the virus doesn't get into these vulnerable settings where there's great risk of not only the virus being spread further, but of course people losing their life as a consequence.
Now, in terms of the state of emergency, this has really flamed up in the last 12 to 18 hours with the opposition on the crossbenches suggesting that the Premier wants to extend the state of emergency by 12 months. Why does it need to be extended by 12 months in one go? Could you come back at, say, 3-month intervals instead?
Well, certainly the reality is the emergency services legislation that we're using that underpins this, when it was written, it wasn't written in reference to pandemics. It was written in reference to bushfires and floods and other types of states of emergency, where those emergencies will come to an end in due course over a number of months. Pandemics, of course, have the capacity, from what we've seen historically, to last 3 or 4 years. And we need to, of course, recognise that. We need to amend the underpinning legislation to enable us to extend the state of emergency. We don't know, of course, how long this pandemic is going to go. We don't know whether it's even going to be safe to, of course, bring a parliament back in 2 months, or 3 months, or 6 months, or indeed really 12 months. So that's why we need to give the Chief Health Officer the maximum amount of capacity. Now, whether we, of course, end up ultimately using all of that legislative capacity will depend on, at the end of the day, the spread of the virus. The more all of us do the right thing, stay at home, protect our communities, the less likely it is that we'll need to use all of the provision of the legislation.
Do you think that it'll be able to get through Parliament? Because some of the crossbenchers, like for example Fiona Patten, who has in the past voted with the government on a number of key bits of legislation, she's already said she won't be supporting the 12-month thing. Do you think the crossbenchers are going to support it? Will it actually get up? Or, as some are saying, is the Premier saying we'll make it 12 months, but using that as a bargaining technique to really get what he wants, which is maybe 3 months or 6 months extension?
No, look, I think the Premier is acting on the best advice from the Chief Health Officer in terms of what he believes he might require. At the end of the day, of course, it's up to the government to get the numbers in both chambers of Parliament to get that legislation through. I encourage the independents to reflect carefully, to, of course, pick up the phone and have a conversation with the Health Minister and with the Premier if necessary. It's important that we get this done. It's important that we secure their vote to get it done. But look, the reality is the independents are the independents. The best course of action would be, of course, for the Liberal Party to do the right thing on behalf of all Victorians and to support this legislation. It's important to keep us safe. It's important that this legislation gets through to give the Chief Health Officer the necessary legislative power to ensure all of our safety. I think it's really incumbent on the Liberal Party to do the right thing and to vote with the government to get this done and to stop playing cheap party politics.
Should Parliament be sitting at the moment, and what should it look like? Because, of course, you would have seen the controversy around the Legislative Council being forced to sit because the crossbenchers and the opposition up there have the numbers. And there was a whole thing with Jenny Mikakos, and I think she wasn't very happy about Parliament sitting and refused to answer questions and said it's sending the wrong message to Victorians more broadly. So should Parliament be sitting at the moment, and if so, what should it look like?
I'm sure the Geelong community would be rather disappointed if the Liberal Party forced me to go to Melbourne, forced me to participate in the Parliament and to have me bring that disease back to our community where we might see people die. That is the consequence of Parliament's been asked to sit when it's not safe to do so, and that is the reality of several weeks ago. The Chief Health Officer made it clear he did not believe it was appropriate that the Victorian Parliament sit because of the consequence of the potential spread of COVID-19. I'm going to accept the advice of the Chief Health Officer. I'm happy as a parliamentarian to attend Parliament, to be accountable when it's safe to do so, and I'm not putting my community at risk. I'm happy to sit back, to listen to the advice of the Chief Health Officer and to implement that advice, because I do not want to be responsible for spreading COVID-19 through the Geelong community, through my participation in the Parliament.
I watched Richard Marles in Federal Parliament yesterday asking a question in question time via video link from his office here in Geelong. Could you have similar video Parliament provisions like they're doing now with the Federal Parliament?
Well, it's clear that technology has come a long way. Indeed, all of the Victorian parliamentary committees have been meeting via various online platforms. I believe the technology is now sufficiently developed that we can potentially participate in a virtual parliament. I certainly think that's something that the Victorian Parliament should think about, should reflect on what the Commonwealth is doing, and if there is the opportunity for regional MPs to participate in a virtual way, I think that makes sense. I think it makes sense that we consider that and, if appropriate, implement technology to enable us to do that.
And council elections, they're going ahead, according to the local government minister, because there was talk about whether or not they may be postponed. Some people have said council elections should be postponed because it's a disadvantage to new candidates, people that haven't run before, because they can't go out and campaign as easily and can't boost that local profile. What are your thoughts on that?
Look, I don't think it provides any strategic advantage really for anyone. I think the honest reality is that certainly from my experience, most people don't know who their councillors are, whether they're long-term councillors or whether they've served just 1 or 2 terms. I think the reality is these days we conduct these elections by postal vote. I think there's every opportunity for people to get their message out to the community as to what their values are and what they stand for. And I'm confident, on the advice of the Chief Health Officer, that the council elections can take place. It certainly means that people can't do any door knocking or street stalling at this stage. It's not safe to do so, but it doesn't provide any strategic advantage for any particular incumbent. And I do note that the call for postponing of the election is predominantly, from as far as I can see, been made by existing sitting councillors who, of course, would like to see their term extended.
And just last of all, community sport, that's been supported by a few grants I can see. You had a bit of a meeting involving Ros Spence and a few other local people on Zoom about that?
That's right. So as a part of our economic recovery plan, our willingness to stimulate the economy, we've made some grants available to the City of Greater Geelong Council for them to update their ovals, to provide LED lights, to enable footy training to get underway, to enable people to be able to train in the cold, dark winter months. Those grants have been made available, and I look forward to that infrastructure being installed over the coming few months for the commencement of the next season. I think this will be a welcome addition to those successful footy clubs. I certainly can recall playing football in the dark of winter and having difficulty in marking the ball and doing all sorts of finger injuries because there wasn't adequate light. It's great to see the investments that have been made over the last decade or two into our local sports clubs so that they can provide the appropriate infrastructure to enable people to be able to train in the dead of winter in a safe way. And I think it's going to be a welcome addition to those successful sports clubs.
Well, Darren, thanks for being on the program. Always good to catch up, and I'll speak to you again next month.
Terrific. Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. Darren Cheeseman joining us here, the State MP for South Barwon.